Pemirsa, selamat datang lagi di acara Diplomatic Club yang diselenggarakan oleh kuatbaca.com. Kali ini saya punya tamu spesial dari Ukraina, Kedutaan Besar Ukraina. Yang hadir di sini adalah Duta Besar sendiri, yang mulia Dr. Vasyl Hamianin. Selamat pagi, good morning.
Selamat pagi, Bapak.
How do you say good morning in Ukraine?
Dobroho ranku.
Dobro ranku. Yeah, okay.
It's good morning.
Good
literally.
morning. Yeah. And as before, we invited also Ambassador Ludmila here. So it's not fair if I not invite you. So now it's your turn. But basically, Diplomatic Club is designed for general public. And when we invite ambassadors, mostly our first topic is about bilateral relation and how do you feel about Indonesia? How do you think about the Indonesian? What is your impression after few years in Indonesia? And we also discuss about the bilateral trade, especially the potentials that we can do. Because now we are looking for, we call it non-traditional market. By non-traditional market, we mean like Eastern Europe, Africa, and so on, and Latin America. That's also a non-traditional market. We try to explore, these opportunities. I myself, now I'm a private citizen. I was ambassador in Moscow and Abu Dhabi and consul general in Melbourne. But now I'm retired, and I'm happy to be your host today. Yeah, Dr. Vasyl Hamianin. Yeah. Now first we will talk about bilateral relation, especially. What do you think before you arrived in Indonesia? I know you were posted some years in China, in Beijing, and you might be familiar because you speak Mandarin as well. But I presume that you don't speak Bahasa Indonesia before you come here, But what do you think? Because it's far away from Ukraine. What do you think about Indonesia, and how do you know about Indonesia?
Well, first of all, salam kenal, Yang Mulia.
Yeah.
Saya sangat senang bertemu dengan Bapak-Bapak dan berkunjung studio ini. I'm really grateful for your invitation, but I'm very open to communicate with anyone in any country, with media, with experts, with diplomats, with students. So every time I come, I really want to share everything I know and everything I feel with everyone. So having such a clever and wise audience as you have in Indonesia. I think that you are lucky here. So
thank you.
We can share something well to each other. And because every time, as you mentioned, we worked in China, I like one phrase by Confucius, whoever you meet on your way, if you meet 3 people on your way, 2 of them can be your teachers. I always try to learn something from my meeting, from my communications. Well, for me, Indonesia has always been a mysterious land because I've never been here before I came here 2 years ago. I worked a long time in China, but never visited Indonesia. Just never happened. I was before I was like in Philippines, in Thailand, in China, like of course Hong Kong, and but never in Indonesia. So that was a discovery. A big surprise.
Do you have any references about Indonesia when you were in?
Yeah, of course, of course. Well, I mean, your country is a huge country. It's a big nation with a long history, with outstanding cultural traditions, and with I think your Indonesian biodiversity and ethno-linguistical diversity is the second in the world. If I'm not mistaken. Biodiversity is second after Brazil. Because and the
tropical
ethno-linguistical, the second after India. So I mean, this is a country to be invented, to be
Thanks
open.
God we have Bahasa, because we have 700 ethnic groups with totally different languages, even in Java.
Absolutely.
If I went to Bandung, they speak in Sundanese, I could not understand what they're saying.
Bahasa Sunda. But they have
there are some words,
Some words. For example, you say sami-sami. Both in Bahasa Sunda, Bahasa Jawa, sami-sami. So
some greetings a bit similar, but when you talk continuously, we don't understand.
No. It's so the first impression was a land to be discovered. That's to be let's say it like this. And when before that, what I knew, I knew a few things. Well, definitely Indonesia, Bung Karno, Suharto, President Suharto. Then General Sudirman, of course. Then, of course, Jawa, Sumatra, Gunung Api. That's we know.
Did you travel a lot in Indonesia? Did you travel a lot?
Not yet, but well, traveled a little bit, but a lot of places no. Tomorrow I go to Makassar for my first visit to Makassar.
First visit.
So, Gunung Api, yeah, all this, and the of course orangutan, of course like harimau Sumatra, all that. So, I knew few things, of course, from the history. From the history, I think few prominent figures I knew, like Diponegoro, because I did my PhD in world history. But well, it was about
specializing in
China history of the first half of the 20th century. But it was somehow related, right? So somehow in some
history is always
parallels. Exactly. So that's why I could know something, but not that deep, right? So
how about food? You find it difficult to find the food? To many Westerners, Indonesian food are too spicy.
In Indonesia, my problem with food was I was looking for spicy food and I could not find. That was my problem, because I love spicy food. Till now, I couldn't find the food that I could call spicy.
You have to. I think you know nasi padang, yeah. That's one of
no spice. No, I've been trying for 2 years. I've been trying to find in Manado.
Even for me, Japanese, too spicy, because Java is a bit mild, you know.
Yes. No, I love spicy food. I lived 9 years in China.
Oh,
so
right.
I love Hunan,
Hunan
food, which is like burning. A lot of things, cultural things, natural things, stories. Okay, I didn't know about for example, Bahasa Jawa, Carakan, all this. But maybe because I didn't try to go deep into that. Of course, I knew about old kingdoms that everybody who learns history knows about, like Mataram, Majapahit, Pajajaran, all this, all these Sundanese kingdoms. Like I live in Kuningan, it's one of the kingdoms also, Galuh. Then we have Cirebon kingdom, we have Kediri. With famous Ratu Joyoboyo.
What is your favorite or most favorite food?
Food in Indonesia.
Nasi goreng?
Honestly, sop buntut.
Sop.
I love sop. All kinds of soups. But sop buntut is very special. It's very special. And sate juga.
Sate,
Like from among the famous. But not goreng. Anything goreng, I don't like goreng.
Yeah.
If I ask me, I prefer bakar.
Bakar,
like something, or on the open fire, like barbecue, See, barbecue, seafood, barbecue, ayam bakar, barbecue, whatever,
Okay, we signed a joint communique in June 1992, to open diplomatic relations, and then Indonesia opened our embassy in 1994, and you opened embassy in 1996,
Yes.
It's still relatively new. How do you find the relation between Indonesia and Ukraine in many aspects? Of course, politics, from economic and trade relations, and then people to people. How do you see the development?
Well, you're right. Both Indonesia and Ukraine, I will call them like young democracies, because we're trying to find the path through the calamities of these previous times. We're trying to find a real path towards the true democracy, true equality, between all the members of the society. So it's normal for the young democracies to start from the surrounding geography. So that's why, Indonesia, I think, has been more concentrated on this region, Southeast Asia, then South Asia, then Pacific, then East Asia, Australia, this region, and Ukraine was more concentrated on the European region, then former Soviet Union, of course, like old connections, and then certainly like Northern Africa as the markets, and the Middle East, etc. So for some time we were like far away, just far away, and we were like developing relations from the scratch, like from nothing. However, as you remember from the history, Ukraine was the one who initiated the membership of Indonesia in the United Nations in 1946. It was Ukrainian delegation who raised the issue, not the Soviet, not the Russian, no, Ukraine. And we did it, right? So
when was that?
1946.
46. But that's
Yeah, Manuyevsky,
but
yes.
it's under Soviet Union, right?
Yes, but we have the separate delegation. We have the delegation of Ukraine in the UN, and Manuyevsky, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, he initiated this, and we fought 3 years for Indonesian place in the UN. So that's how our relations started. But then, so at present, I would say that our relations are friendly and stable. No problems in that. Though I think that if we use mathematics, so I think we use less than 1% of our potential. That's what I mean. Exactly what I mean. Because, for example, a few things, right? We have we used to have before the Russian aggression, we used to have 1.3 billion of dollars of turnover. But there were just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 positions. Not very diverse.
What is the biggest trading partner?
EU of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Now or
No, on before.
I think, well, if you don't take the European Union as one partner, then it will be China.
China, yeah.
China, we had around, for example, with Indonesia before the war, we had 1.3 billion. With China, we had 15 billion, 10 times.
10 times.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And your biggest export, I think, wheat, to Indonesia?
No, not no? To Indonesia. Yes.
Yeah, to Indonesia.
I think there were only two main positions. We export wheat, and Indonesia export palm oil. It was like
because we are the second biggest eater of noodle in the world after China. So we need wheat.
Yeah. Well, there was big trade. I think there was because. For Ukraine, Indonesia was the second biggest importer of Ukrainian wheat after Egypt.
Oh, right.
Egypt number one, you number two. So has been for some time, and we were increasing. We were trying to diversify, right? So not just the wheat, but the mixtures, but the other cereals.
What is the potential for, or both sides from Indonesia and from Ukraine? What could be the potential of trades?
Yang Mulia. It's limitless, literally, because, for example, let's say you imported less than 2 million tons, right? Ukraine can produce around 79 or 80 million tons. You buy 1.5.
I think we import the biggest one from Australia, if not mistaken.
Every country diversifies its supplies. It's normal. You import from Australia, Canada, maybe China, I don't know. India, maybe Russia. But our wheat is cheaper and good quality and stable. We can stably, it's very stable in price and in volumes. So we were a good partner and very reliable for Indonesia.
What is the potential for investment on both sides?
Potential of the investments, it's a tricky one because to invest, you need to really understand what are you doing. Really clear, because it's not just trade, right? You have to invest and get the profit out of this investment in some time, right? So to invest, you have to understand the stability in the political system or big profits. You have to understand the stability in economic system, or again big profits, So the potential is huge. Why? Since I came here 2 years ago, I proposed quite a lot of projects to Indonesian government and businesses, and I think we are starting to discuss something, especially in the spheres that are of great interest to Indonesia. We have a top level high technologies in the green energy, in for related to electric cars, related to the environmental protection, related to the geo scanning, finding the natural resources, related to the helicopters and aircrafts we can produce, or we can produce together here, for example. It's good proposals.
With PTDI, for example, Dirgantara Indonesia, I think you can work together with them.
I've been trying to talk to many people. Plus IT products. We're extremely good in IT and cybersecurity and things. It's not talking about for example, the investment into the food processing, for example. Why not?
Yeah.
I mean, people can, you produce a lot of cocoa, a lot of coffee. We can make, for example, good example, Indonesia can invest into Ukraine, into building up the food processing factory and selling best chocolate in the world to the whole world, to Europe, for example. Why not?
Possibly noodle.
Noodle?
Yeah.
Any type
Because
of noodle.
we in Nigeria itself, we have 3 factories in Nigeria. In
Good
Saudi,
idea.
there are 3, and also Ethiopia, it just opened 1. Because our strength, in noodle is very good.
Why not? Yeah. I tried
Because wheat is very cheap, of course, in Ukraine.
noodle, instant noodle. Well, we have in Ukraine now. We have.
Are they familiar? I mean, the Ukrainian, are they familiar with food like noodles?
Of course.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Like there are, as far to my knowledge, there are 3 big producers of instant noodles, for example, like Indomie, like Chinese noodles, then Korean noodles, Vietnamese noodles.
Do any of them open a factory in
Vietnam.
Vietnam?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think only Vietnamese companies, big company, I think the biggest one in Vietnam, they opened many years ago.
So mostly import?
No, mostly locally produced.
Or local produce?
You see, Ukraine is a big and very famous agricultural country through centuries. So to be honest, we don't like consume a lot of instant noodle or something too much. We have a lot of food, and it's like, just imagine, we consume roughly 20% of what we produce. 20%.
Okay.
So we export that. So we have all sorts of, not just wheat. We have like 20 cereals, all different, all different, and it's all there on the market. So people just very picky, like, oh, I don't like this. So food in Ukraine, quality is extremely high, and people tend to think that it should be very healthy, not just high. That's why instant noodle or something, the people think that maybe it's not healthy enough. So it should be more expensive, but healthier.
Just practical.
Well, yes. So, I mean, it's a huge variety of food, but we can do anything. I mean, I have proposals now for Indonesian investors. Now we have the war, right? But the opportunities are huge. It's you can buy really a cheap business and develop it into huge profits, huge profit, highly profitable business now. So,
Excellency, how do you find the people, knowing that Indonesia, as mentioned, second most diverse, country in terms of ethnicity. People say some 700 ethnic groups with totally different, not totally, but with different languages. Not dialect, it's different. And even for me, Javanese, Javanese is different, From, of course, West Java, they speak Sundanese. But even within Java, we are different also in terms of the dialect. And the way that people speak, some people from Jogja and Solo very soft speaking, but from my area, close to West Java, they say very rough, But we are more straightforward, How do you find this so diverse people, and how do you make it familiar with them?
How do I find diverse people? Well, this is a question that we can discuss for hours, actually, because it's like long topic. You see, Ukraine is a much smaller country than Indonesia, but we still have like more than 130 ethnic groups, and they are different.
How many?
130, more than that. In indigenous people, we have like maybe up to 10, maybe, but not that much. In Indonesia, I repeat, I lived some time in China. That's again a country with diverse cultures and everything. But in Indonesia, I discovered that you speak to people dari Jawa, and then you speak to people dari East Java,
and then from
and
Sumatra,
then from West Java, and then Batak people, and it's like all different people, all different ways of communication, right? So when I talk first, like now I communicate with people dari Central Java, dari orang Solo, orang Yogyakarta. It's like a cabbage. You never know what's inside. You try to talk and we try to find the real meaning of what it was, what I was told. It's like one layer, and it never ends. I say, oh my God, what did he mean? Or what?
Sometimes you have to interpret what they're saying.
You see, the problem is, I asked after some discussions, I asked the people who were sitting next to me, who were not Javanese, I say, do you understand what it was? Like, can you explain it? No, I don't understand myself. So that was, And then you talk to Batak people, straight like Ukrainians, like, dun, dun, dun. 3 words we understood. So I just spent 5 minutes, I got all the answers. No, no, yes, yes. See you later. So it's different. It's different, and it's, it would be very entertaining for the ethnographs and linguists. But sometimes for diplomats, when I want the straight answers, like because it's a war, right? So sometimes I really need some advice or need some straight answer. I never get them, and I feel anxious. So, oh my God, why? And then so it's the bad story about us is that we, in Ukraine, we never actually learned seriously the Indonesian culture, the Indonesian cultural background in a due scale. There are some people, not many, in Ukraine that really learned, like researched, did some, investigations, did digging deep, but not many.
I think
we need to do it more.
Culture is one most interesting thing when every country has. That's why in my book, this book, which I give you. So basically, I'm talking mostly about how I used culture for diplomacy.
I like this gesture. It's not exactly this. But
and it means many things.
Exactly.
The Japanese signal.
Exactly. That's it. That's it.
So in this book, because I was posted in 3 countries, I was posted 3 times successfully for 11 years in Australia.
11 years
11
in
years,
Australia.
3 times posting. It's very rare, It's very unusual, for one to be posted from third secretary to head of mission, consul general in one place. And then I moved to Middle Eastern country, United Arab Emirates, which has totally different, culture.
Sure.
In Australia, whether people like it or not, whether we are fighting, to be invited for lunch is an honor. So sometimes we have disagreement in the table. It's very common. As long as we speak it, through, it's on. Frank manner. But in Middle East, that's not the way. It doesn't mean that they're not friendly, but that's not very common. Like first time I invited one DG for information, and he said, "Inshallah," in the Western habit, if we invite 12:30, I'm there 15 minutes before.
Well, yeah.
I was waiting 15 minutes. He didn't show up until 1 o'clock. He didn't show up, and I called, switch off.
And
he didn't come. He didn't show up.
Okay.
So, but next time I saw in a party, he suddenly grabbed me and kissed me 3 times. How could I get angry when he kissed me already 3 times? But that's the way, So when we know them, they're very friendly as well, But it's a matter how we cannot change their culture.
It's different,
But we have to understand it, and it's totally different. Then I moved to Russia, and my first reading is a book called Russia, A 1,000-Year Chronicle of the Wild East by Martin Swisher. He's former correspondent of ABC. It's about mostly history from Rurik the Rush to Putin. Many things I can learn, and especially because my background is literature. I'm close to something to do with culture. So I presume that Russian, the ordinary people, they love in culture, they love in arts. So my first plan is to open or to initiate the Indonesian Festival and very social 4 times. And now our trade keep increasing and so on. So this is about my book. So culture is something that we can connect to in the world. So
yes,
that's my
no doubt.
And every culture they have their own wisdom. There is local wisdom, something like that. I find it very difficult. Although we are Muslim and of course Middle East Muslim, we are familiar, share the same religions, but culturally very different. But we have to understand each other. That's what my book is about. Now, I'm talking about the before, and this is very big news in Indonesia also, before touching to your relation with Russia. But on the, what do you think the current conflicts in between Palestine and Israel? What I read is that Ukraine is more favored for Israel because of the links and so on. So what do you think the current event in Middle East, and what is there any impact on Ukraine and so on?
Good question, and I think that's a first. I'm not an expert in the Middle East events, but what I can tell you, two things. First, it's a very popular misunderstanding in Indonesia that Ukraine is standing on the side of Israel and not on the side of Palestine. I want to clarify this clearly to put the end to this misunderstanding. And I don't want to be mistreated by the people, which is not right, right? So first, as you might know, Ukraine was one of the first countries in the world that recognized Palestine as an independent state and a member of the UN. Ukraine recognized and accepted all the resolutions of the UN regarding the Palestinian state. And Ukraine was one of the first countries to open the embassy in Ukraine with the ambassador as the head of mission. Not just the embassy, with the ambassador. And we have been good friends and have very good relations. I don't know why people just ignoring this fact always. Second, Ukraine has been standing on very clear and very transparent positions regarding everything, especially after we had our own war. 10 years ago, it didn't start yesterday, it started in 2014 with the Russian attack on Crimea. Since then, at least, we stand on a very clear position. The position must be that humanity, justice, rule of law, human rights. This is critically important to understand what is our treatment. And Ukraine has always been very consistent on opposing the terrorism. Terrorism is not forgivable. That's why Ukraine never stands on a double standards position. Never. Whoever commits the terrorist attack on other nation, whoever tries to kill civilians, to torture civilians, to occupy the land, whoever will be treated respectively
But your
as a terrorist.
Your response to Hamas, of course, this is cannot be justified. It's different from the excessive response from Israel.
Why? What is the difference? Did you hear the statements by my president? For example, do you know that a few days ago, a week ago, President of Ukraine and President of Indonesia had a talk, phone call, and they discussed the Middle East issue, the situation in Gaza. My president made himself very clear that they are supporting the humanitarian corridors. We are standing on the position that humanity should prevail and no crimes against humanity should ever be committed in this territory. And we are standing for the principle of two states as it is supported by Indonesian government and as it stayed enshrined by the UN resolutions. So we don't have any difference in the position regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza. No difference. We are supporting the operation of humanitarian corridors. We are standing for de-escalation of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, etc. But at the same time, we cannot remain silent when the terrorist attack from Hamas on Israel was committed. How we can do this? We just, whatever bad happens, we must say a word if asked. Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
So in this case, I don't see any contradiction here. We have been very consistent on that.
Now,
and Ukraine, we are supporting the humanitarian endeavors of any country or organization to help civilians to survive. It's human. Simple. You don't need to be Indonesian or Ukrainian or whoever to help the children under bombardments. You have to be human. Full stop.
Now, my readings, you condemn, of course, the terrorist act of Hamas, but you fail to condemn the same thing to Israel, also who kill many civilians. This is excessive and create demonstration all over the world, even in the United States.
Again, I repeat, I did not learn this question in depth. I did not learn this. What we know from our experience is every country has the right to defend its civilians, at least, and defend its against the terror attacks. That's what we have for a long time already. Russia as a terrorist state attacks us all the time. All the time. It's bombardments for 2 years, and before that it was 8 years of occupation and that. We know what it means. That's why, of course, we recognize the right of any nation, of every nation, to protect itself, to protect its civilians from the attacks. That's it. So we're talking about condemnation of, I think that what's important here is humanity and not the wordings. Are we helping people? Are we trying to save the civilians out of the city? Are we trying to save the children there? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to save the hostages taken by whoever? We have thousands of Ukrainian children in the hands of Russians as hostages. And we are shouting about it for 2 years to the world. Help us to bring the children back. Help us to bring our prisoners back and our hostages back. And many countries help, but many countries just give a blind eye. We don't want to know. What we call it humanity. We should care about the humanity. And if you stand on this nilai, right? Yeah. Like justice and humanity, for example, just 2, enough.
Okay, my last lead you to question, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tough question.
My readings in 862, Rurik established from Viking, actually, yeah? Viking ethnic group established Kiev and Rus in Novgorod. And then Grand Prince Oleg, this I took from the history books,
From,
882, Grand Prince Oleg moved the capital to Kiev. And then you also share the same hero, like Vladimir, Prince Vladimir. You have statue in Kiev, and Moscow also have statue in Vladimir. So my understanding, basically, you come from the same descendants, just like Indonesia and Malaysia, where 75% of Malaysian originally come from Indonesia. But we have a difficult question, difficult history path, like we have a confrontation in the past. But now we are peaceful nations under ASEAN. Now, could you tell us about, because in my note also, actually, you have really independent only in 1918 for 2 years, And most of the time, you're part of the Russian kingdom and Soviet Union. Okay, could you tell me what is the current relations with Russia, and what do you think that Indonesia can do?
The second question was very tough. And okay, any of these questions, Yamulia, will require me to separate story, yes, and it will take like hours to discuss, because the point here is Russia has been creating mythology about the origins of Russia for centuries, not just since at least last.
But that's from the book that I read.
I'm telling you, Russia has been creating mythology for.
No, that's written by Western people.
It doesn't matter, Western or Eastern.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what, because I've been listening and reading. Okay, I did my PhD in world history. I told you that, and I've been looking at a lot of books. So there's a lot of mythology in there. Doesn't matter who is Chinese historians, Indonesian historians, or Western historians. Everyone has a chance to be mistaken. And it's easy. How do you know it's a wrong approach? Because when I read the same wordings, the same schemes and the same stories in the books of Indonesian professors, in the book of American professor, of European professor, and of Russian professor. I know there's something might be wrong. It's like copy paste and copy paste. And you know what? As a historian, I might tell you, it's not sastra, it's sejarah, it's different. In history, we always dig to the roots. We always need the proofs. If there's no proof, that's lies. There's no grounds on that. So, first, Russians and Ukrainians.
So how do you, in your history about Rurik the Rus, didn't he establish the Kievan Rus?
Right. Listen, first, I'm telling you this important thing. When Kiev was one of the biggest cities in Europe, maybe the second biggest after Constantinople in that time, in 13th century, Moscow didn't exist as a city. When it was destroyed by Mongolian army in 1240, Moscow was still like a village, like somewhere lost in it never existed. So telling us that Ukrainians and Russians are the same origins, it's just at least contradicts the science and history at all in general. We're different tribes, we're different language, we have different traditions, we have different origins, very different.
But countries not established for ethnicity, country mostly established for colonial border.
Exactly.
And Russia also was part colony of Mongol for 240 years.
Exactly. First, Russians have picked up all the structure of state from Mongolians, and we did not. Ukraine has never had this in our blood, in our system, never. Second, Ukraine was never the Ukraine was not the part of Russia for a long time. Parts of Ukraine were parts of the
Poland, Lithuania.
Lithuania, Austro-Hungarian Empire.
But the other part also part of the Tsarist.
Some part were the part of the Ottoman Empire. Some part was the part of Moscow Kingdom.
Yeah.
Because even the word Russia, they've stolen from us. In the Emperor Peter the First is not great. He's the killer of Ukraine, actually. But Peter the First, he's stolen this name from us because there was Moscow Kingdom, and then it became Russian Empire all overnight. This doesn't work like that, right? So part of Ukraine was a part of Russian.
All history books I read, mostly written by Western historians, so on, about Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and so on,
Traditional callings, yes. So what? Ukrainian historian has been not calling them great since times immemorial, never. Even in 19th century, no one called them great because they were not.
Yes,
So you were asking about the relationship.
Yeah.
So the history of Ukraine, of modern Ukraine, for last 350 years, was the history of fighting for independence from Moscow Kingdom, or if you like it, Russian Empire. 350 years of fight. With pauses, but fight. During the old times, we were trying to get rid of Muscovites or Russians, whatever you call them. It happened in, end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, then Soviet times, then Second World War. We've been trying desperately to do this.
But leaders like Khrushchev is Ukrainian, right?
Well, Khrushchev was Ukrainian, and Brezhnev was Ukrainian. Yeah, so what?
Because that's the system. If we are talking about the victim, many Russians also become the victim during Stalin, for example.
Yeah.
And Stalin is not Russian, it's Georgian.
Yeah, that's why. It doesn't matter who were they, Russians, Ukrainian, or Georgians, or I don't know who. It's important that they were the system, part of the Soviet Bolshevik communist system. So the system was the killer of the people, not concrete. Stalin did not kill the people himself, right? But he created the system. Actually, Lenin has created the system. There was the...
That's why Khrushchev and then de-Stalinization.
Big mincer of the people's lives. Tens of millions of people just killed. Yeah, so it was not about Georgians or Ukrainians or Russians. It was about the system of communism.
I think the main problem is because Ukraine is trying to join NATO. And, NATO actually promised twice in 91 and 90 during the meeting between James Baker and Khrushchev, Gorbachev, that NATO would not extend to the east. And what happened? The former Warsaw Pact, the former Soviet Union becoming NATO. And the same thing like Georgia want to become NATO in 2006, and then Russia invaded Georgia. But after that, quite, because Georgia does not insist, So I think the problem is because of NATO factors. Because if Ukraine becoming NATO member, it means there is like a threat, in the doorstep of Russia.
My good question. I've been answering this question millions of times already, and now please follow this. Please follow this logic. First, and NATO never promised. Can you show me the document that promised that NATO will not be growing or something?
Yeah,
there's no document.
There's in the it's written in the National Archive of London in UK.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So
and the second meeting 91 is meeting between Director General for Political Affairs.
It's just meetings about something. Yeah. It's
but
meetings.
there is a note there, a statement by
Listen, it's very important to understand whom this statement was made to Gorbachev.
Yeah.
Who was Gorbachev? He was the president of what? Of non-existent country. I'm sorry. This country nobody ever promised this to democratic Russia. It was in the Soviet times, even if promised.
But he was still the chairman of Soviet at the time when meeting James Baker in Berlin.
I'm sorry to say that. I mean, did anyone has ever made a promise to Indonesia before 1945? Is it valid till now? Or maybe someone made promises to the Ottoman Empire.
And actually,
is it valid for Turkey now?
91, Yeltsin sent letter to NATO.
So what?
To join NATO, but it was refused.
Yeah.
And then also
that's a good point. I know this.
Yeah, it was refused. I mean, it means that NATO tried to conceal Russia.
NATO has never been a threat to Russia. NATO was the bloc that was created to oppose the Soviet Union, which was a threat.
But the war already ended. I mean, good war already ended. So what is the point of having NATO again?
Of having NATO again?
Yeah. I mean, NATO is created during the Cold War. This between US
look around
and Soviet Union.
What's the point of having NATO? Look around you. Look at Europe. Russia, since 1991, initiated the war in Moldova, killed people, and created the island of Russian culture. It initiated war in Georgia, between Abkhazia and Georgia, killed many people.
Yeah, that's because Georgia wanted to join NATO.
Nobody wanted to join NATO. It's not. I mean, Russia was afraid. Okay, you now declare that someone declares, "I want to join NATO," and then it's a point to kill people and occupy the territory. Is it good reason for that? Even if anyone declare I want to join, okay, I'm declaring, I say, Pawahid, I want to marry your daughter. Just say, I declare this. And you say, kill you. I don't even try to say anything, kill you. Is it good reason to kill the civilians?
Because that was regarded as a threat, sovereignty.
Now what they have now? They have 2 more NATO countries, plus 1,000 kilometers of NATO borderline with Finland, and they will have the plus 2,000 kilometers of NATO from Ukraine, and this is inevitable. So, what was the threat? The country that did you know that Ukraine was never promised to be a NATO member? We speak about that. We want to be a NATO member. NATO said no. NATO never said that Ukraine will be a NATO member. Was it a threat? It sounds strange, right? So you kill the people. Well, wait. Moldova, Georgia, Chechnya. As independent state, Russia killed around 300,000 Muslims, civilians in Chechnya. For what? For joining NATO? Then Georgia.
But before that, there was also terrorist attack in Moscow and many other parts of Russia at the time.
Yeah, there's good reason to kill the 300,000 of civilians.
That's like what Israel was doing.
Terrorist attacks in Moscow there are a lot of proofs that they were initiated and set up by Putin and his services. But whatever happens, does this justify the killings of, tell me this simple question, does this justify the killings of hundreds of thousands of civilians, Muslim civilians in Grozny, in Chechnya, other regions? Does it justify that? That they have something in their mind and then kill them all? Does does it justify or not?
Well, I'm not trying to comment on that because so many complicated stories behind that. You know, I don't want
many
to
complicated things, Park.
I don't want to get into detail on this. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But what we have, don't want to draw attention from our audience. It's hundreds of thousands of killed civilians in Moldova, in Georgia, in Chechnya, in Azerbaijan and Armenia, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Syria, in Georgia again, in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of civilian people killed by Russian army. Is this not a fact?
Yeah. No.
And we can talk about hours. Yeah. We talk about the reasons why for hours, but this is the fact. Hundreds of thousands of killed civilians by Russian militaries. This is a fact.
Yeah. There's another fact also. According to the international relations professor in Indonesia, U.S. had breached the international law 52 times, attacking other countries without consent of Security Council. You know, and in Iraq, 2 million people vanished. And okay, but now I don't know whether
how this refers to Russian-Ukrainian.
Well, I don't want to go into detail.
No. This is Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. What happens now?
Because you know there are two other stories. You know, two other stories. Like for example, you have your own Russia have own stories about the Donbass and so on. You know, like the banning of local language, indiscriminate arrest and so on the southern
Who
part.
told you that?
Well, that's why. No,
that's a mythology that Russians created.
Yeah, that's two part. They have their own story. No. Okay, now I don't know whether you listen to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, you know, the Nobel laureate, this about Ukraine. I just read one paragraph for you. Yeah. Well, I already give advice many times to Ukrainian people, government, which is do not get caught in the proxy war between US and Russia, because your country will be destroyed, and that's the tragedy. I said to Ukrainians, look at Afghanistan. Isn't that what you want to look at? 15 years of occupation and continued destruction. 20 years basically from the time of the US invasion. Don't do it. I told them, as my life has been helping Vietnam, Cambodia, Iraq, this ends in destroying countries. I think there is one part that I would like to mention. The Ukrainians have the right to choose their own economic future, their own political future, but not their own military future, because choosing their own military future, for example, Ukraine saying our future is that the US has military bases in Ukraine, it's not a choice that Ukraine can make by itself. That is a threat to Russia. I would advise strongly the Mexican government, for example, do not make a military alliance with China. That's not your choice. That would be a threat. By the way, if Mexico one day said, we listen to the US, we can do anything we want, we are free people, we choose China as our partner, I would predict that US invasion of Mexico would start in a minute. This is what Jeffrey suggested to Ukrainians, you know. So because for Russia, I think it is about sovereignty, because if they, like here in ASEAN, we don't want Singapore, although Singapore is very close to the West, but I think no Asian country want Singapore to be military base or Singapore joining NATO. That's the analogy.
You see, it's well, whoever can say any words, but I'm asking, who is this man to tell?
He's Nobel laureate.
No. Whoever he is, even if he is even if he's a tsar, a whatever king, right? He doesn't have the right to dictate to sovereign state whether to become the member of what or not. Who is he to tell us not to join this and not to join that? And who is he to tell us what is the threat to whoever? We know one thing for sure, and this is a fact again. What he says is blah blah. What I tell you is a fact. Russia is an aggressor, and it attacked neighboring countries For many time, even during last 30 years, I told you just now, Georgia, Moldova, whatever, yeah, many. Russia is a threat for us. That's why the countries of the Eastern Europe, after the destruction of the Soviet Union, what they did first, we want to be a part of NATO because Russia is an aggressive state and it will attack. Once they get muscles, when they get stability, they will attack. This is an inevitable forecast. Nobody doubted that Russia would attack. Nobody did. We all knew, sooner or later. That's why these countries were cleverer than us. They get to the NATO as quick as possible. We were late. I admit this. Having NATO in Ukraine, whatever they say, whether it is threat or not, you look at the logical chain of events, right? So now Russia didn't want to have a NATO basis close to Russia, right? Now they will have the NATO bases in Sweden, which remained the neutral for centuries, 200 years. Now they have Finland, which remained neutral for 80 years. And they will have eventually, I think that Austria will join because this is crazy. And then they'll have Ukraine and they'll have Georgia, Moldova in NATO. This is the result of Russia's clever foreign policy. But don't forget, before, nobody mentions this, but remember when the Soviet Union was destroyed, or disintegrated, right? What happened then? The West come to Russia and they say, we trust you, we want to be partners. That's why Ukraine has the third biggest nuclear potential in the world after the US and Russia. The third. We had thousands of big missiles with the nuclear warheads. We had the bombardiers. We have the everything. Yeah? What they said, Ukraine, you must give your nuclear weapons to Russia because Russia is our partner. NATO has established partnership with Russia.
Yeah, there's Russia-NATO Council actually.
But everything. They have a huge cooperation. Even there was a stories that like they were discussing that Russia might be a member of the NATO, might be a member of get visa-free regime with the European Union, etc., etc. Yeah, Ukraine never had these prospects. Never, ever. We never had this cooperation with NATO as Russia did, and they've taken all the nuclear weapons from us for Russia. So where is this threat? If NATO was the threat, NATO would come to Ukraine and say, "Okay, we built up the base now. We'll leave all the nuclear weapons here, and we'll be protecting us from Russia." No, they didn't know that. So Russians are lying. Don't you think so? It's very obvious. They're liars. Because we were not the threat. We didn't have anything.
Yeah, not Ukraine the threat. The NATO is the threat.
NATO was not the threat. If it was the threat, they would have did it long time ago. In 1991. Why didn't they do it? They say, no, Ukraine, no NATO. No. Why? Where is the threat? Where is the threat from NATO towards Russia? Where it is?
Okay, I have to stop.
And first and second, last one. If the NATO is the threat, why they don't attack NATO? Why they attack smaller countries without any protection? Georgia, for 20% of the territory is occupied. Ukraine, why? Moldova, why? Because that's Russians. That's imperialist. They never changed through centuries.
Okay, thank you, Excellencies, for your time. It's already 45 minutes, I'm reminded. Well, nice meeting you. My first time to meet you.
My pleasure and my honor.
Okay, thank you. So I hope
it's not the last one.
Well, we can see. Mostly we are looking for other issues, like in the future, for example, we are looking for positive things about potentials. There are so many great potential that we can have, but unfortunately, we are too busy with our traditional partners. Of course, we still have there, but I think we look like Africa, for example. China has been there,
Even
our
who?
China.
Oh, China,
Been there for India, been there.
Yeah.
We are the country who initiated the, you remember 1955
Yeah, of course.
Asian African
Bandung Conference, yeah.
Bandung Conference. But in terms of trade, we are very small even
Yes.
compared to others. And also, I think to Eastern Europe, which has very big potential to us. And basically, we are not competitors. We need each other. Like we need wheat from you, and then you need like palm oil from us, and so on.
That's normal.
So it's complementary. So this is one of our mission, during my retirement. Okay, thank you, Excellency. So
Thank you.
hope to see you again.
Vasyl
Thank you.
Hamianin.